My name is Marcus Webb, and 6 months ago I thought my biggest problem was whether to finally replace the cracked windshield on my pickup truck that had been spiderwebbed since a hailstorm last spring. I was 28, working nights as a meteorological systems technician at the Harrow County Emergency Coordination Center, and my world revolved around monitoring atmospheric conditions and maintaining the automated weather station network that kept our isolated valley informed about the Pacific Northwest's notoriously unpredictable weather patterns. My uniform was simple: a black hoodie with a faded logo from my previous job at a tech startup that went under, dark jeans that could handle crawling around equipment installations, and steel-toe work boots that had seen better days but were still comfortable during 12-hour shifts monitoring systems that most people never think about until they fail. Harrow County sits in a valley between two mountain ranges where weather systems collide and create some of the most unpredictable atmospheric conditions in the region. Population 3,847 on a good day, surrounded by dense forest and accessible by only two mountain highways that close regularly during winter storms. The town exists primarily to support the weather monitoring station, a small regional airport, and the handful of government facilities that need constant atmospheric surveillance. My job was straightforward: maintain the Doppler radar array, calibrate precipitation sensors, monitor barometric pressure readings, and ensure the integrated public alert and warning system could push weather warnings to every device in the region when severe conditions developed. The Emergency Coordination Center sits on a hill overlooking the town, a collection of white concrete buildings surrounded by meteorological equipment that looks like something from a science fiction movie. Doppler radar dishes, wind measurement towers, automated surface observing systems, and arrays of sensors that measure everything from humidity to electromagnetic field variations. My workstation consists of 8 monitors displaying real-time weather data, satellite imagery, atmospheric pressure maps, precipitation forecasts, and emergency alert controls that could warn the entire region about everything from flash floods to severe thunderstorms. Night shifts were typically a meditative routine of coffee, system checks, and the rhythmic drumming of rain on the reinforced roof. The weird readings started showing up 3 weeks ago during what should have been routine autumn weather patterns. I noticed it first in the barometric pressure data from Station Alpha 7, located 15 miles northeast of town. The readings showed pressure increasing with altitude instead of decreasing, which violates basic atmospheric physics. I figured it was a sensor malfunction, so I drove out there the next morning to recalibrate the equipment. Everything tested normal, but when I checked the data logs, the impossible readings were still there, recorded with perfect precision and cross-referenced by multiple independent sensors. Then other stations started showing similar anomalies: temperature inversions that lasted too long, humidity readings that spiked without corresponding precipitation, wind patterns that moved in perfect circles without any meteorological explanation. Most disturbing were the electromagnetic readings. Every station was detecting low-frequency pulses in perfect synchronization, like something was broadcasting a signal through the atmosphere itself. I mentioned it to my supervisor during our weekly briefing, but he just grunted and told me to keep monitoring for equipment drift. That's when the federal directive arrived through our secure communications system. NOAA headquarters, priority classification, routed through the Department of Homeland Security. Harrow County Atmospheric Anomaly Monitoring, Level 2 protocols. The document was mostly standard government language, but 3 sections made my hands shake. Do not discuss atmospheric anomalies with local population. All field personnel to carry personal weather monitoring devices. Under no circumstances, initiate IPAWS severe weather warning without federal authorization. A new alert template appeared in my emergency warning system that I hadn't created. Project Nimbus, Level 2, atmospheric containment. No description, no authorization signature, origin listed as Federal Atmospheric Research Division. When I tried to access the template details, my clearance wasn't sufficient to view the content. The first impossible precipitation event occurred at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night when every weather model predicted clear skies. I was alone in the facility, monitoring a routine high-pressure system, when every precipitation sensor in the network activated simultaneously. Not gradually, not following storm patterns, but instantly, like someone had thrown a switch. The radar showed precipitation falling across the entire region, but the returns were wrong. Instead of the familiar green and yellow patterns that indicate normal rain intensity, I was seeing blue and purple signatures that suggested moisture moving upward through the atmosphere. I stepped outside to verify what the instruments were telling me, and that's when I saw it. Rain was falling upward, not mist or vapor rising from heated surfaces, but actual raindrops moving from the ground toward the sky in steady, impossible streams. The drops were perfectly formed, catching the facility's security lights as they ascended into the darkness above. I stood there for 5 minutes, watching water defy gravity while my brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing. The air felt thin, drained, and some deep animal part of my brain screamed that I was standing under an open mouth. When I went back inside, every monitor was flashing red with system alerts. Atmospheric inversion detected. Precipitation pattern anomaly. Barometric pressure critical. The automated weather station was trying to categorize an event that violated the laws of physics, and its programming was failing to find appropriate classifications. I tried calling my supervisor, but my phone showed no signal despite being inside a facility with multiple communication arrays. Then, at 11:52 p.m., every emergency alert system in the facility activated simultaneously. The piercing tone that usually preceded tornado warnings or flash flood alerts filled the building. But when I looked at my IPAWS interface, I hadn't initiated any alerts. The system was broadcasting on its own, using the federal template I couldn't access. My hands were shaking as I watched the message appear on every screen, pushing out to every device in Harrow County. Emergency alert. The rain is falling upward. Stay indoors. Do not look directly at precipitation. This is not a test. Outside, the upward rainfall continued. Streams of water flowing toward the sky like gravity had reversed itself. The Doppler radar showed the precipitation extending up beyond the atmosphere's normal limits, disappearing into space itself. And through the facility's cameras, I could see lights in town flickering as people noticed the impossible weather and stepped outside to witness the night that physics died in Harrow County. The emergency alert's piercing tone was still echoing through the facility when every weather monitoring station in my network began transmitting data that violated the fundamental laws of physics. My black hoodie clung to my back with nervous sweat as I watched precipitation readings climb, while humidity dropped to zero, barometric pressure increasing exponentially with altitude instead of decreasing, and electromagnetic signatures pulsing in patterns too regular to be natural phenomena. The automated systems were generating error codes I'd never seen before, trying to categorize an atmospheric event that shouldn't exist, while my steel-toe boots felt suddenly heavy against the concrete floor as reality shifted around me. The county emergency radio network erupted with panic chatter from local authorities trying to understand what they were witnessing. Sheriff Martinez's voice cut through the static, strained and disbelieving. Emergency Coordination Center. I've got multiple reports of precipitation moving upward throughout the county. Can you confirm this is some kind of weather service malfunction? Deputy Chen's response came from the north sector, her usual professional composure cracking. Sheriff, I'm standing in the middle of Main Street watching raindrops fall toward the sky. My patrol car's instruments are showing readings that don't make sense. Fire Chief Rodriguez added his own bewildered report. Webb, our station's rain gauge is running backward. Water is flowing up the collection tube and disappearing into the air above us. Before I could respond to the radio traffic, my secure communication system chimed with an encrypted federal transmission. The sender showed DHS Atmospheric Research Division, but the message content made my stomach drop. Marcus Webb, Harrow County EOC. Project Nimbus Atmospheric Manipulation Test proceeding as planned. Continue monitoring. Do not interfere with precipitation patterns. Federal Coordination Team en route. Agent H. Reeves, DHS Yardie. The timestamp showed the message had been sent 4 hours before the upward rainfall began, which meant someone had known this was going to happen and had planned for me to witness it. My phone buzzed against the console with competing text messages from the same sender. Webb atmospheric anomaly is weaponized phenomenon. Facility is compromised. Evacuate immediately. Doctor. Sarah Chen, NOAA research, followed immediately by previous messages disinformation. Remain at station. Continue observations per federal directive. Dr. Sarah Chen, NOAA Yardie. Both messages arrived with identical timestamps, but contained completely contradictory instructions, suggesting either a system malfunction or someone was actively feeding me false information. Through the facility's external cameras, I watched Harrow County transform into something from a nightmare. The upward rainfall was intensifying, streams of water flowing from every surface toward the sky in perfect vertical columns that caught the streetlights and created pillars of ascending moisture stretching into the darkness above. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of roads, their drivers having stepped out to witness the phenomenon despite the emergency alert's explicit warning not to look directly at the precipitation. On camera 7, monitoring the town square, I watched a group of people standing transfixed, their faces turned upward, letting the impossible rain stream past them toward the sky. The Project Nimbus documentation updated itself on my secure terminal, new sections appearing as I watched. Level 3 Protocols Hydrological Displacement Entity Manifestation contained information that made my hands shake. Upward precipitation indicates successful atmospheric inversion and entity feeding cycle initiation. Subjects exposed to inverted precipitation exhibit progressive atmospheric dependency. Initial symptoms include respiratory distress and neural repatterning, followed by cellular restructuring, then complete molecular integration with atmospheric medium. Entities classified as HDEs, hydrological displacement entities, use precipitation as transmission vector and feeding mechanism. My secure line flashed with an incoming priority connection. I routed it to my headset, trying to keep my voice steady. Harrow County EOC, Webb speaking. Static filled the line for several seconds, then a woman's voice, controlled but carrying an undertone of barely suppressed panic. Marcus Webb, this is Special Agent Hannah Reeves, DHS Atmospheric Research Division. I'm your federal contact for Project Nimbus. I need you to describe exactly what you're observing right now. Rain falling upward across the entire valley, I said, watching the impossible streams on my monitors. Electromagnetic readings are off the charts, barometric pressure is inverting, and people are standing outside despite the alert warning them not to look at it. Through camera 12, I could see the man in the heavy coat from the town square. He was swaying now, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle, mouth open, catching the upward-flowing drops. As I watched, his outline began to blur, becoming translucent, wavering like heat shimmer. "That's not rain anymore," Agent Reeves said quietly. Project Nimbus was designed to test atmospheric manipulation protocols using engineered condensation nuclei. We discovered something was responding to the manipulations, using them as a feeding mechanism. The entity we're dealing with exists in atmospheric medium. It feeds by pulling moisture upward and converting organic matter into gaseous components it can absorb. On camera 12, the man in the coat collapsed to his knees, but instead of falling forward, his body began to dissolve, streaming upward with the rain in wisps of vapor and moisture. The other people in the square didn't react, didn't help, just continued staring at the sky with that same slack-jawed expression. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, "it's dissolving people." The entity requires precise atmospheric conditions to complete manifestation, Reeves continued. Your facility serves as the primary atmospheric anchor point. The Doppler array and monitoring equipment create electromagnetic resonance patterns that guide the feeding process. Every person who makes direct visual contact with active precipitation becomes a host for what we call condensate forms, parasitic atmospheric entities that ride the upward moisture flow. The proximity alarms on the facility's perimeter sensors triggered simultaneously. Something was approaching the hill. I pulled up the relevant camera feeds and saw them, dozens of figures emerging from the town below, moving up the access road toward the Emergency Coordination Center. They walked with that same unnatural gait I'd seen in the man at the town square, too loose, too fluid, like their joints had been replaced with liquid. Some were partially translucent, their bodies wavering between solid and vapor states. "People are coming up the hill," I said, my voice barely steady. "A lot of them. They're moving wrong, like they're not entirely solid anymore." Through camera 3, I watched Deputy Chen leading the group, but her uniform seemed to be dissolving and reforming with each step, her face shifting between human features and something made of ascending water droplets. "Condensate forms seek cognitive hosts," Reeves explained, her clinical tone not masking the fear underneath. "People who looked directly at the precipitation are now carrying atmospheric parasites in their perceptual systems. The upward rain acts as a bridge between their consciousness and the entity's feeding mechanism. They're drawn to electromagnetic sources. Your facility is broadcasting a signal that calls to them." The building's structural sensors reported impossible strain patterns, not downward pressure from weather, but outward tension, as if the entire facility was being squeezed while gravity reversed itself around us. The electromagnetic readings spiked again, and every upward stream visible on the monitors curved slightly inward, feeding into a vast, invisible funnel shape above the valley. "What's the endgame here, Reeves?" I asked, watching the approaching figures reach the outer security fence. "How does this thing finish feeding?" The people at the gate didn't try to climb or break through, they just stood there, letting the upward rain flow through their increasingly translucent bodies while they all turned their heads toward the facility's cameras in perfect unison. "In controlled tests, the event terminates when atmospheric moisture reaches critical depletion," she said. "The entity disengages, the atmosphere normalizes, and residual condensate forms evaporate. But Harrow County represents the first populated test environment. We're in uncharted territory regarding scale and intensity." A new alert flashed across my monitors. "Atmospheric entity breach facility perimeter compromised." Through the internal security cameras, I could see shimmering distortions moving through the building's corridors, humanoid shapes composed entirely of upward-flowing water, their forms constantly dissolving and reforming as they moved with liquid grace toward the control room. The entity wasn't just outside anymore. It had found a way inside. "Marcus," Reeves said, and the use of my first name carried a weight of finality. "Whatever happens next, do not open any doors. Do not let anything inside that control room. The condensate forms will try to establish direct contact, and they'll sound like people you know. They'll use voices of people you care about. But everyone in Harrow County who looked at that rain is gone now. What's coming for you isn't human anymore." The radio crackled with Sheriff Martinez's voice, but it sounded wrong, too fluid, like he was speaking through water. "Webb, this is Martinez. I need you to open the facility doors. We have injured people who need shelter. The rain is getting worse, and we need to get everyone inside where it's safe. Through the cameras, I could see Martinez standing at the main entrance, but his uniform was streaming upward with the rain, and his eyes reflected the facility's lights like pools of dark water. Behind him, the sky was no longer black but filled with a massive, rotating column of ascending moisture debris, and what looked like human shapes, all spiraling around a point of absolute darkness that seemed to extend beyond the atmosphere itself. The entity was feeding, growing stronger, and I was the only person left in Harrow County who hadn't looked directly at the rain that was rewriting reality one drop at a time. The radio crackled with Sheriff Martinez's voice, but the words flowed like water through a broken dam, each syllable stretching and warping as it passed through speakers that were never designed to carry the voice of something that was no longer entirely human. "Marcus, you need to open these doors. We've got injured people out here, kids who are scared, elderly folks who can't handle this atmospheric pressure." Through camera one, I watched Martinez's form pressing against the reinforced entrance, his outline blurring at the edges where the upward rain streamed through his increasingly translucent body. My black hoodie clung to my back with nervous sweat, as I realized that the thing wearing my sheriff's face didn't understand that our facility sat at 2,400 feet elevation, where atmospheric pressure should be significantly lower than what my instruments were now reading at ground level. The entity was learning to mimic human speech, but it hadn't mastered the details that would make the deception perfect. Agent Reeves came back on the secure line, her professional composure finally showing cracks. "Marcus, I need to tell you something about Project Nimbus that wasn't in your briefing materials. This isn't our first test site. Millbrook, Oregon in 2019. Clearwater, Montana in 2021. Riverside, Washington just 6 months ago. 3 other communities that officially never existed after we finished our atmospheric manipulation trials." Her words hit me like a physical blow, the implication clear. Harrow County was expendable, just another data point in a federal program that treated entire towns as laboratory specimens. The entities we're dealing with aren't random atmospheric anomalies. They're hydrological displacement entities, parasitic organisms that exist in gaseous medium between dimensional barriers. Project Nimbus was designed to attract them using specific electromagnetic frequencies, then study their feeding patterns and atmospheric manipulation capabilities. My fingers flew across the console, accessing diagnostic menus and system logs that most technicians never touched. If Reeves was telling the truth about previous test sites, there had to be documentation somewhere in the federal database, classified files that would explain how this nightmare was supposed to end. The internal cameras showed condensate forms moving through the facility's corridors with increasing boldness, their liquid bodies flowing around obstacles and seeping through ventilation systems that should have been sealed. These weren't the shambling, confused figures I'd seen outside. These entities moved with purpose, drawn by the electromagnetic signatures of my monitoring equipment like moths to a flame that would consume them and everything around it. The feeding process involves progressive molecular dissolution of organic matter, Reeves continued, her clinical tone not masking the horror of what she was describing. Subjects who make direct visual contact with active precipitation become hosts for atmospheric parasites that rewrite their perceptual framework. They begin to see reality through the entity's perspective, which guides them to sources of electromagnetic energy and atmospheric moisture. The host body undergoes gradual restructuring until complete integration is achieved, and the individual is absorbed into the entity's collective consciousness. Through camera 12, monitoring the town square, I watched the water tower beginning to dissolve, its steel structure streaming upward in metallic ribbons that caught the facility's lights as they spiraled toward the dark collection point above. The entity wasn't just feeding on people, it was consuming everything, converting matter itself into atmospheric medium it could absorb. Buildings were becoming translucent, vehicles were dissolving into component elements, and the very ground was starting to lift away in streams of vaporized earth and stone. An unauthorized file appeared on my secure terminal. Project Nimbus, Termination Protocols, Eyes Only. The document header showed classification levels I'd never seen before, but someone had pushed it through the system with administrative override codes. The content made my hands shake. Electromagnetic anchor disruption represents only viable termination method for active HDE manifestation. Facility-based Doppler arrays must be overloaded simultaneously to create destructive interference patterns within entity's resonance field. Warning: procedure will result in total system failure and potential atmospheric cascade effects, extending 50+ miles from anchor point. The control room door shuddered as something heavy struck it from the corridor side. Through the reinforced glass, I could see a shimmering distortion that looked almost human but moved like flowing water, pressing against the barrier with impossible strength. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once, seeping through the ventilation system and emerging from the speakers with my mother's inflection. "Marcus, sweetie, you don't have to be alone in there. It's so hard being alone when everything is changing. Just open the door and let us help you understand." I backed away from the door, every instinct screaming at me to respond to that familiar voice, but my training kept me focused on the technical solution. The facility's power grid was already fluctuating as the entity's atmospheric manipulation affected electrical systems throughout the valley. Emergency lighting flickered between normal illumination and complete darkness, while my monitoring equipment displayed readings that defied physical laws. The Doppler arrays were drawing more power than their systems were designed to handle, their transmission strength increasing automatically as the entity pulled electromagnetic energy from the facility's grid. "Reeves," I said, my voice barely steady, "what happens if I overload the arrays? What happens to the people who are already integrated?" There was a pause that lasted too long, filled with the sound of rushing water that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. "The integration process is irreversible, Marcus. The people you knew in Harrow County are gone. What you're seeing now are condensate forms wearing their memories, using their voices and faces to manipulate you into providing access to the facility's electromagnetic systems." Through camera 15, monitoring the generator building, I watched the backup power systems beginning to lift off their foundations, steel and concrete streaming upward in impossible defiance of gravity. The entity was consuming the facility itself, converting my workplace into atmospheric medium while using the electromagnetic pulse from the overloaded Doppler arrays rippled through the facility like a physical blow. And in the sudden darkness that followed, I could hear something vast and ancient recoiling above Harrow County, with a sound like atmospheric pressure, equalizing through a breach in reality itself. My steel-toe boots felt unsteady on the concrete floor as emergency lighting struggled to activate, casting everything in hellish red while my monitors flickered between static and complete blackness. The upward streams of rain visible through the reinforced windows faltered, individual droplets hanging suspended in midair, as if gravity and the entity's manipulation were locked in mortal combat for control of basic physics. The condensate forms pressed against my door, recoiled with a sound like steam escaping from industrial pressure vessels, their translucent bodies wavering between liquid and vapor states as the electromagnetic interference disrupted whatever force held them in human-like configurations. Through the internal cameras that still functioned, I watched them flowing backward through the facility's corridors like water running uphill. But they weren't disappearing. They were consolidating, regrouping around the building's remaining power sources, preparing for something that made every instinct I had scream warnings. Agent Reeves came back on the secure line, her voice cutting through static that sounded increasingly like whispered rain against windows. "Marcus, what did you just do?" "I'm reading massive electromagnetic disturbance centered on your location. The atmospheric entity signature is fragmenting, but it's not dissipating, it's concentrating." Her words confirmed what my failing instruments were trying to tell me. The pulse hadn't destroyed the hydrological displacement entity. It had forced it into survival mode, compressing its distributed feeding network into a desperate, concentrated manifestation directly above the facility. Through the skylight in the control room ceiling, I could see the dark collection point descending, no longer a distant void but a massive, rotating funnel of atmospheric distortion that stretched from the storm clouds to just above the facility's roof. The entity was abandoning its gradual feeding strategy, pulling everything within reach upward in a concentrated effort to absorb enough matter and energy to establish permanent anchor points before the electromagnetic interference could disperse its cohesion entirely. "Reeves," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while watching my pickup truck rise off the ground outside, spinning slowly toward the descending funnel. "Tell me the truth about Project Nimbus, all of it." There was a pause filled with the sound of rushing wind and electronic interference. When she spoke again, her professional composure was cracking. "This isn't our first test site, Marcus. Millbrook, Oregon in 2019. Clearwater, Montana in 2021. Riverside, Washington just 6 months ago. 3 other communities that officially never existed after we finished our atmospheric manipulation trials." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You're telling me this has happened before, that Harrow County was just another experiment." Through camera 8, I watched the water tower beginning to dissolve, its steel structure streaming upward in metallic ribbons that caught the facility's emergency lighting. The entity wasn't just feeding on people anymore. It was consuming everything, converting matter itself into atmospheric medium it could absorb. "The hydrological displacement entities aren't random atmospheric anomalies," Reeves continued, her voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "They're parasitic organisms that exist in gaseous medium between dimensional barriers. Project Nimbus was designed to attract them using specific electromagnetic frequencies, then study their feeding patterns and atmospheric manipulation capabilities. You weren't hired as a meteorological technician, Marcus. You were recruited as an unwitting observer in a federal program that treats entire towns as laboratory specimens." The facility's structural integrity alarms triggered as the building itself began to lift, not catastrophically, but gradually, like the entire structure was being drawn upward by invisible cables. The Project Nimbus documentation on my terminal updated itself in real time, new sections appearing as I watched. Emergency Protocol 7, Entity Survival Mode Response. HDE Survival Mode represents maximum threat scenario. Entity will sacrifice distributed feeding network to establish single permanent anchor point. Successful anchoring results in dimensional breach, allowing unlimited entity population influx from parallel atmospheric medium. Heavy footsteps approached through the corridor outside, moving with human precision rather than the flowing movements of condensate forms. Through the security cameras, I could see a figure in tactical gear, a woman with graying hair and a face marked by exhaustion and something that looked like guilt. When she reached the door and spoke, I recognized Agent Reeves's voice without the electronic distortion. "Marcus, it's Hannah Reeves. I'm here. The real me. I need you to open this door so we can implement the termination protocol together." "How do I know you're not another condensate form?" I called through the reinforced barrier, my hand hovering over the atmospheric controls. "Because the electromagnetic pulse you triggered disrupted the entity's ability to maintain complex manifestations," she replied without hesitation. "The condensate forms you've been seeing are breaking down, but the entity is adapting, concentrating its remaining energy into a single anchor point. We have maybe 10 minutes before it establishes permanent dimensional breach. Through the reinforced glass, I could see her holding up a ruggedized case that hummed with internal electronics. I brought the real termination protocol, Marcus. Not the atmospheric decompression system they wanted you to use. That would have killed everyone in the valley. This is a resonance disruptor that can shatter the entity's cohesion matrix, but it requires manual activation from inside the electromagnetic field you created. I opened the door, and Agent Reeves stumbled inside. Her tactical jacket scorched and her face bearing the kind of exhaustion that comes from watching too many impossible things destroy too many innocent people. "The other test sites," I said as she set up the device. "What happened to them?" She looked up from the complex array of sensors and transmitters, her eyes carrying the weight of decisions that would haunt her forever. "Millbrook lost 312 people. Clearwater lost 67. Riverside. We aborted halfway through, but 43 people were already integrated into the entity's feeding matrix." "And now Harrow County," I said, watching through the cameras as more buildings began to dissolve, their structures streaming upward toward the massive funnel above us. "How many people are left?" Her fingers flew over the device's controls, calibrating frequencies that would either save the Pacific Northwest or scatter the entity into fragments too small to track. 19 confirmed survivors in the high school gymnasium and the church basement. People who listened to your alert and stayed away from windows during the initial manifestation. The resonance disruptor activated with a sound like tuning forks striking in perfect harmony, its frequencies building to a crescendo that made my bones ache. Through the skylight, I watched the dark collection point begin to fragment, the massive funnel breaking apart into thousands of smaller distortions that scattered across the valley like seeds on the wind. The upward rain stopped, gravity reasserted itself, and debris that had been streaming toward the sky crashed back to Earth with thunderous impacts. But as the entity's primary manifestation collapsed, Reeves's expression grew grim. "It's not destroyed, Marcus. We forced it to disperse, to fragment into smaller, harder-to-detect anchor points. The immediate threat to Harrow County is over, but we've also taught it how to survive federal termination protocols. It's going to spread, establish multiple feeding sites across the region, learn to be more careful about drawing attention." The facility's power grid failed completely, plunging us into darkness broken only by the faint glow of the disruptor's cooling systems. Through the broken skylight, I could see normal clouds for the first time in hours, no longer rotating, no longer feeding something that shouldn't exist in our atmosphere. "What happens now?" I asked, helping Reeves pack the termination device into its protective case. "Now we do what we always do," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd participated in too many cover-ups. "We contain the narrative, scrub the records, relocate the survivors, and classify everything that happened here above top secret." Officially, Harrow County suffered a catastrophic atmospheric event, freak storm, possible chemical contamination, structural failures that made the area uninhabitable. She pulled out a smaller case I hadn't noticed before, opening it to reveal a ruggedized laptop, satellite modem, and several external drives. "Unofficially, someone in the chain of command thinks what you did tonight matters. That forcing the entity to fragment instead of letting it complete its feeding cycle might be the only reason we're not looking at a column of upward rain stretching into orbit right now." The case also contained a thick folder marked Project Nimbus, Field Anomaly Reports, and other tabs labeled with names I didn't recognize. Project Fulcrum, Project Eidolon, Project Thresher. Too many projects, too many ways to break the world in pursuit of weapons that should never exist. "There are others," Reeves explained, pushing the case toward me. "Technicians, dispatchers, emergency coordinators who were on the ground when atmospheric manipulation experiments went sideways. Most didn't survive. A few did, and they tend to end up like you, out of a job, full of questions, not sure whether they stopped something or just made it worse. We left the facility together through the emergency access tunnel, crawling through darkness while the building collapsed behind us. The massive radar dishes finally succumbing to structural damage and crashing down in explosions of twisted metal and shattered concrete. When we emerged into the pre-dawn air, Harrow County looked smaller somehow, diminished, like a photograph left too long in direct sunlight. The town below showed lights in only a few windows. The survivors Reeves had mentioned, people who'd listened to the emergency alert and stayed indoors while their neighbors dissolved into atmospheric medium. 19 people out of 3,847, huddled in basements and interior rooms, waiting for an all-clear signal that would never come because their town would officially cease to exist within the week. 6 months, Reeves said as government vehicles arrived to begin the evacuation and cleanup. Give it that long. You'll start seeing patterns in the weather reports, local anomalies where rain falls light but leaves nothing wet, where fog hangs against the wind. It won't be dramatic, nothing like this. You broke its teeth, but it's still hungry and it's learned to be patient. She climbed into a black SUV, then rolled down the window for one final warning. In 6 months, if you still want answers, open that case. Or you can pretend it was just a storm that went wrong and get very good at ignoring strange things on the news. But I don't think you're built for ignoring systems when they fail, Marcus. People like you never are. As the convoy of government vehicles disappeared into the dawn, carrying the last survivors of Harrow County toward new lives with manufactured explanations, I stood alone in the middle of what had been my workplace, surrounded by the wreckage of equipment I'd maintained for years. The case Reeves had given me felt heavier than it looked, weighted with the knowledge of how many other towns had been sacrificed to Project Nimbus and its sister programs. Above me, the sky looked almost normal, but I knew better than to trust appearances. Somewhere in the atmosphere, fragments of the hydrological displacement entity were learning to hunt more carefully, establishing anchor points in places where upward rain would be dismissed as weather anomalies. The electromagnetic pulse had saved Harrow County by destroying it, but the entity was still out there, still hungry, and now it knew that people like me existed, people who understood systems well enough to break them when breaking them was the only way to survive. 6 months later, I still wake up at exactly 3:47 a.m. every single night, my body locked into that moment when the Doppler arrays overloaded and sent their final electromagnetic pulse rippling across Harrow County, fragmenting something that had no business existing in our atmosphere. The studio apartment I rent in Spokane feels deliberately temporary, furnished with the kind of generic pieces you buy when you're not sure you'll be staying anywhere long enough for it to matter. My black hoodie hangs in the closet next to 3 identical replacements, because some habits become armor, and I'm not ready to change what kept me alive that night. The steel-toe work boots sit by the door, polished but barely used since I haven't worked a real job since Harrow County was administratively dissolved and erased from every map that matters. The cracked windshield on my pickup truck is still cracked, a spiderweb of fractured glass that serves as a constant reminder of the night physics died in a mountain valley. The official story, buried on page 8 of the Seattle Times regional section, described a catastrophic atmospheric event with chemical contamination that killed 2 federal researchers and forced the permanent evacuation of an isolated mountain community due to ongoing environmental hazards. The facility was sealed, the population relocated for their safety, and within 6 weeks, Harrow County had been redesignated as a geological survey area with restricted access. Search for it on Google Maps now, and you'll find empty forest with a notation reading, Atmospheric Research Station Federal Property, no public access. The 19 survivors were relocated across the Pacific Northwest, their medical records showing treatment for chemical exposure-related respiratory symptoms. They're moving expenses covered by a FEMA disaster relief fund that doesn't appear in any public database I can access. I tried contacting other survivors during those first desperate weeks, but the phone numbers I'd memorized led to disconnected lines or people who claimed never to have heard of any place called Harrow County. Sheriff Martinez's personnel records show he transferred to a department in eastern Oregon, but when I called, they insisted they'd never employed anyone by that name. Deputy Chen's pension is being paid to a Sarah Chen in Tacoma who's been retired for 5 years and has no memory of ever working in emergency services. Either the federal cleanup was more thorough than I imagined, or the atmospheric distortions affected people's memories in ways that make my scatteredentity theory look optimistic. The case Reeves gave me sits on my nightstand like a loaded weapon I'm afraid to touch too often. Project Nimbus, Project Fulcrum, Project Eidolon, a litany of classified programs, each designed to prod and poke at the fabric of reality, each leaving a trail of vanished towns and shattered lives. The files paint a terrifying picture of a government that stumbled onto dimensional parasites and decided to weaponize them instead of containing them. But what keeps me awake isn't just what happened, it's what's still happening. I've become an unofficial monitor, tracking regional weather anomalies and cross-referencing them with obscure local news reports. A small town in Oregon reports a week of unseasonal dry lightning. A remote research station in Alaska experiences gravity fluctuations. A stretch of highway in Nevada where drivers report missing miles. These aren't the dramatic, town-consuming events of Harrow County, but subtle, insidious incursions. The entity learned to feed without triggering federal response, taking small bites from reality's edges like a predator that's learned to hunt in shadows. My apartment walls are covered in maps, timelines, and cryptic notes, a paranoid web of information that would get me institutionalized if anyone saw it. Red pins mark anomalies, string connects patterns, and in the center of it all is a growing certainty that I didn't kill the hydrological displacement entity. I taught it to be more efficient. But I've also learned something the federal researchers never understood. People like me don't just maintain systems, we know how to communicate through them. If the government won't let me near official emergency networks, I'll build my own. I started writing stories. Not official alerts or technical reports, but creepypasta. Horror fiction that smells too much like memory. I post them on forums, call into late-night radio shows, upload videos with titles like Emergency Alert. The rain is falling upward that people click for a scare and then forget. Except some don't forget. Some look twice when drizzle hangs strangely in the air. Some close their windows when storms feel wrong. Some obey the small, quiet rules I bury in the narratives. Don't stand in open ground when the first drops hit. Don't look straight up into heavy rain. If water seems to hesitate mid-fall, get inside. If fog moves against the wind, don't follow it. Last week, I got an email from an address that shouldn't exist. A NOAA internal handle paired with a personal Gmail. Subject line: You were right about the Nebraska event. No greeting, just confirmation of a low-density atmospheric node that dissolved 3 deer and an irrigation pump before dissipating. Someone inside is paying attention now, and they want my help. I don't send them everything. I send pieces. Enough to confirm I know more than I should, not enough to make me indispensable. I've seen what happens to people the government considers vital assets in projects like these. Sometimes when it rains in Spokane, I stand by my window and watch carefully. Gravity still works. Water still falls down. But every so often there's a flicker, a spray that reaches too high, a drop that jumps instead of falls. My rational brain says turbulence. The part of me that spent 12 hours watching water climb to the sky says it's something testing the air. I don't sleep well. When I do, I dream of Harrow County. Not the horror but quiet mornings before, when the valley was full of low clouds and normal rain. Sometimes the dreams slide and I'm back in the control room hearing footsteps that splash on dry floors. A voice whispers, "We're still in the air, Marcus. You broke us apart, but we're everywhere now." I always wake when the first drop hits my ceiling from the wrong direction. It never actually does. Not yet. Here's what I can't shake. In every Project Nimbus termination report, there's a recurring line. Post-event atmospheric monitoring indicates persistent low-level anomaly. HDE signature reduced but not eliminated. Risk of re-engagement, ongoing. Last week, Dr. Chen's email pinged again. "We have confirmed upward mist in a closed underground facility. No water source. No natural explanation. You were right about global distribution. Underground, no sky, no rain, just air and something in it reaching